extent do you think, or what are the, how can we talk about the differences, say, between Vietnam and Afghanistan, Iraq, in the sense that during the Vietnam era there was a draft in place, and we're talking about Cold War structures, and also the impact that the drafts they had on soldier attitudes and perceptions of what they were doing versus, say, our military who are serving today. Because today, I think also, when you look at media coverage, when the war first broke out in March 2003, anybody that was critical of that war was labeled unpatriotic. You know, somehow you didn't support our troops. And, you know, because there were a lot of people that were opposed to this war and that linkage issue that they made between that and 9/11.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could comment on those differences.
Something that surprised me, because I'm a product of my environment. I spent my entire adult life in the Army, and we, there's kind of this narrative, this historical narrative that we have. It's almost like folklore now for us that during Vietnam the public didn't support us. They were spitting on troops in the airport and all that. What I found through this research and through some of the other research I've done is that absolutely was not the case. During the Vietnam War, people supported their military, and they appreciated the sacrifice of the military there then just as much as they do today, maybe more so. I mean, in my opinion, having been to war, I think their sacrifices were greater than ours, frankly. But you're absolutely right that the draft was a deciding factor in two ways. First, there was much more public activism because the threat of participating was much greater, and because the military was much larger and there was a much larger percentage of the American population that was in Vietnam, to the tune of 4 or 5 times more than are in Afghanistan right now. So it was a lot more personal to people, which motivated them to get out and express themselves, something that you do not see in nearly the same scale for either of the wars that we're in now. The other thing about the draft is we're an all-volunteer army now. You could say we're an all-volunteer army. Many people like me who are a little long in the tooth now didn't know we were going to be spending every other year away from our family. But we still, I could have left any time I chose to stay. So we're an all-volunteer force. So you're not going to see as much of an anti-war movement inside the U.S. military as you did during Vietnam, where you had people who were conscripted. They were forced to go in the military against their will. They went. There are, again, speaking for myself, there are people within the military, kind of the rank and file and middle management, who don't agree with the war that we're in, but we have volunteered to go, so we go and we do our duty and we come back. There were a lot of people who were forced to go to Vietnam, and they did not want to go, and when they came back, they told Americans what was going on there. And that's really why I think, like I said, there was such those two factors together, the amount of respect for the U.S. military then as now, and the fact that the military was going to be so vocal was really a deciding factor in those 1971 protests with the Vietnam veterans against the war. When you look at the news coverage, both in print and in television, is dramatic how much more deference they showed to that protest than they had to any before. So, thank you for the question.
I have a couple questions. One, I'm sure mistakenly you referred to Kent State as a riot.
I'm sorry, demonstration, I apologize.
Right.
I apologize.
I mean, that was the National Guard with live ammunition against people who were protesting the war.
I apologize.
The other thing is that, I mean, you can see some parallels in the Vietnamization and in Iraq as well. There was a period where we just kept getting news reports that X number of police were ready to move in. Security forces were almost trained. And then there would often be, you would hear from someone who was actually doing that training, and they would say, well, they're far from ready. But there was that real kind of feeling like we're shifting this war. The other thing is that, I mean, the Sunni awakening was a really important part of the the surge. I felt like the surge became, it's like the administration finally found something like a magic bullet. And if they could apply the same magic bullet in Afghanistan as they had in Iraq, then everything would be all right. And America, through the media, began to look at this idea of the surge as something which would end everything. You know, I mean, it was totally ridiculous, but there it was. The other thing is, you know, I'm fascinated by the idea of how do you define a war at any particular point, you know? Because that's really, if you can come up with the right definition, then what you are accomplishing on the ground can portray the war in a positive way. If you define it in a way that is totally ridiculous, it's outrageous, then you're going to get caught. You're going to be hoisted on your own petard by the news media, for one. So there must have been within the administration during the Vietnam War a constant struggle and a shifting struggle on how we portray this war to the American people.
You know, you kind of touch on two topics there. The first one is really kind of the topic of my book because we came after the surge, before the end of combat operations, and I was in Sunni Arab Iraq. I was up in Tikrit and Saddam's old stomping grounds, and I agree with you that really a dramatic piece of the surge that went, the story that went untold was the Sunni awakening. But I will also tell you that it's a mixed blessing now that they're trying to put it all back together. Yes, it stopped the violence, but now in Saladin province where we were, Saddam Hussein's home province, 1,500 armed Sunni Arab Iraqis that like America, but do not necessarily like the government of Iraq. And we're going to leave, and they're going to be faced, with dealing with the government. That
of course, these are also Sunnis that have been promised to be integrated into the government.
Yeah, and the government doesn't, let us be frank, it's a Shia-led government, and they do not want to integrate, they do not want to integrate the Sunni Arab Iraqis into their military or into their police force, especially, I think the poison pill, if you will, of the awakening was that the people that we were empowering were sheikhs. Real sheikhs, not the kind of guys who wander around Iraq and say, I'm a sheikh, I've got a headdress. Real sheikhs with real fundamental social legitimacy in Sunni Arab Iraqi culture, and those, they'll take, a large portion of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police, obviously in those areas is Sunni Arab Iraqi, but those very, very powerful, socially legitimized people, they do not want to empower by putting them into the military forces. So you've got these chunk of people that you can't integrate, you don't really want to pay so that they can stay armed. It's really, we've kind of created a trap for the government of Iraq. And to the other question of the initiation of the war and is it a war and how do you define a war is really kind of the topic of my dissertation topic. I'm going to be looking at Gulf of Tonkin. Not the incident itself, because that's been done in depth, but over time, how did that change as a political idea as it came into question, as the war came into question, and really use that as a vignette, had the perception of that event as a vignette about the war. And I think that, the United States and Iraq really has had a very similar problem. And in Afghanistan, which is the topic of this paper, has had the same problem because we, way back when, if you roll back the hands of time, we went to Afghanistan in 2001 because the Taliban would not give us Osama bin Laden. And we explicitly said, we're not talking about regime change in Afghanistan, we just want Osama bin Laden. We've got Osama bin Laden. We're still in Afghanistan. So it's going to get increasingly challenging to justify. A telling poll was the week after Osama bin Laden was killed, 68% of Americans said it's time to leave within the next year. That's a pretty high hurdle to get over, even higher than the Vietnam War. So.
Another thing, recently a book came out just in the last few weeks by a member of the State Department who served for a year in Iraq from think he was there maybe shortly after the invasion into 2004.